tale of Kliff and the Grey Wolves, a bedtime story of the continent of Pywel, told in 5 chapters. Settle in now. Pull your blanket a little closer. The fire is low and the wind is quiet, and this is just the right kind of night for a long story, the kind with swords and loyalty, and a man who refused to stay dead. This is the tale of Kliff. Remember that name. You'll want to remember it. Chapter 1. The Hill of No Return. Once upon a time, though not the soft and gentle kind of once upon a time you might be used to, there was a man named Kliff. Now, Kliff was not the kind of hero who appeared out of nowhere with a shining destiny and a sword handed to him by a glowing spirit in a lake. He was not a prince. He was not prophesied. He was something quieter and in many ways something far more remarkable. He was a soldier, a good one, the kind of man who wore his grief the way other people wore their armor, close to the body, tight across the chest, never quite taken off even when he slept. Kliff belonged to a group of warriors called the Greymanes. Now, picture them for a moment. They weren't the grandest army on the continent. They didn't march under glittering banners, or eat off golden plates, or have a castle with 100 towers to call their own. What they had was each other. They had a fire they gathered around at night. They had names they called out across a battlefield so that no one would feel alone in the chaos. They had a leader named Jian, who had built this small and imperfect family out of the kind of people the world had forgotten to take care of: the wanderers, the displaced, the ones with nowhere else to go. And on the vast continent of Pywel, which was a beautiful and terrible place full of 5 great regions and more than 100 factions, all pushing against each other like rocks in a landslide, having a family, even a rough and scarred and battle-weary one, was the most precious thing in the world. You know how that goes, don't you? The best things are always the most fragile. The Greymanes came from a place called Pywel, a land in the eastern part of the continent where rival groups had long kept a kind of uneasy peace. Not a loving peace, not the peace of trust or friendship or shared purpose. More the peace of 2 dogs on opposite sides of a fence, too tired to fight today, but watching each other very, very carefully. It was a peace held together by the fact that no one had yet found a reason to break it, or rather, no one had yet found the confidence to. Then came the Black Bears. The Black Bears were everything the Greymanes were not. Where the Greymanes fought to protect, the Black Bears fought to conquer. Where the Greymanes held loyalty sacred, the Black Bears held only ambition. And their leader, a fearsome, cold-eyed warrior named Muad'Din, had looked at the fragile balance of Pywel and seen not something worth preserving, but something worth breaking. A cracked thing, he must have thought, was easy to sweep away. And from the rubble of what had been, something new could be built. His kind of something. So one night, a dark night, the kind of night made for ambushes, the kind of night where the moon hid behind clouds, as if it too didn't want to witness what was coming. The Black Bears came to the Greymane camp. They had come before. Not long before that dark night, they had struck and struck hard. Jian, the leader of the Greymanes, the heart of the whole warband, was killed in that first terrible blow. And with Jian went something that could never quite be replaced. The certainty that the family was safe, that the fire in the camp would always be burning when you came home. It is a hard thing to lose the person who makes a place feel like home. If you've ever felt that, you'll understand what the Greymanes were carrying in their chests when they sat together in the aftermath of Jian's death. Kliff had stepped into the gap that Jian left, not with triumph, not with a speech about destiny or glory. He stepped in the way a person steps into cold water because someone had to, because the alternative was to let the current take everyone, and because the names of his comrades were etched somewhere in him so deeply that he would have done anything at all, to keep them alive. So on the night after Jian's death, the surviving Greymanes gathered to bury their fallen. They mourned together, the way people who have no one else in the world must mourn loudly in each other's company, with no pretense that it didn't hurt. They spoke about how they had been caught off guard. They speculated and wondered and tried to find the lesson in the loss. And Kliff sat with them, as he always had, quiet and watchful and carrying more than his share. They should have had that night. They had earned it. Just one night of grief without interruption. They didn't get it. The black bears came again. Out of the dark, from every direction at once, the way nightmares come surrounding you before you've had a chance to wake up properly. The Greymanes fought. Of course they fought. They were not the kind of people who lay down and accepted what was being done to them. Kliff fought hardest of all, cutting through the black bears like a man who had decided that if this was the end, it would cost his enemies dearly to reach it. But Muad'Dib came, and Muad'Dib was something different. You could feel it in the air around him, a coldness that didn't belong to the night, a weight to his presence that was less like a man, and more like a force of nature wearing a man's face. He fought Kliff the way a storm fights a candle. And when it was done, when Kliff had given everything he had, and it hadn't been enough, Muad'Dib took the broken man in his arms and threw him into the river that ran below the hill. The hill was called, as we mentioned, the Hill of No Return. Muad'Dib turned away. The matter was resolved. The problem was solved. He did not look back. He should have looked back, because the river, cold and dark, and rushing with all the indifference of deep water, carried Kliff away. And the world, or something in it, or something above it, was paying attention in a way that Muad'Dib had not accounted for. Something had been watching. Something had been waiting. And it was not done with Kliff yet. Not even close. Sleep easy now through this part, because the dark part is almost over, and what comes next is something strange and wonderful and impossible. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine falling into cold water. Imagine the dark closing over you. And then imagine waking up somewhere you have never been, somewhere that should not exist, somewhere that feels like a dream that learned how to last. That's where we're going next. Chapter 2. The realm between waking up in the abyss. Now, most people, when they are thrown into a river after a battle, do not wake up. That's the ordinary way of things. But Kliff's story had already decided it was not going to be ordinary. When Kliff opened his eyes again, he was not in the river. He was not on the riverbank. He was not anywhere in the world of Pywel that he had known, not in the grasslands of Paloon, not in any town or camp or battlefield. He was somewhere else entirely. Above the world of Pywel, you see, there exists a place that the people of the continent call the Abyss. Don't let the name frighten you, or rather, let it frighten you a little, because it is frightening, but it is also extraordinary. The Abyss is not like any place a soldier from Paloon would have encountered. It is not fields or forests or mountains or desert. It is islands, great floating islands suspended in a sky that doesn't belong to the sky you know, lit by light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The architecture of the buildings there defies anything built by human hands. Stone arranged at angles that make the eyes itch. Corridors that bend in directions that don't have names. Machines. Yes, machines. Great humming contraptions of crystal and metal and moving parts that do things Kliff had no framework to understand. It was powered, somehow, by a mixture of magic and technology, by things ancient beyond the memory of any living scholar, by the remains of a civilization that had been, once, so far advanced beyond anything Pywel now contained that they might as well have been gods, and who had, in the end, been destroyed by the very power they had learned to command. But we'll come back to that. Right now, Kliff is waking up on a floor of alien stone, and he doesn't know where he is, and his wounds should have killed him, and he is very, very confused. He got up. This is the thing about Kliff that you need to understand. One of the most important things, the thing that voice actor Alec Newman understood when he spent 5 years bringing this character to life. Kliff gets up, not because he has hope, necessarily. Not because he knows everything is going to be fine. He gets up because getting up is what you do. Because the names of his companions are still in his chest like burning coals. And as long as they are there, there is a reason to put one foot in front of the other. So he walked through the abyss. He solved its puzzles, strange, lateral, logic-defying tests that seemed designed for a mind that had learned to think differently than the battlefield teaches you to think. He navigated its impossible geometry, crossed its floating bridges, descended its crystalline staircases. And as he went deeper, something began to happen. The abyss began to give him things, powers, abilities, capabilities that went far beyond the skill of any swordsman, however good. And at the center of all of it was a bracelet, a strange, glimmering thing of unknown origin that settled onto his wrist as if it had been waiting there for him specifically. The Axiom bracelet, it would come to be called. And through it, the abyss spoke to Kliff in the only language he had ever truly understood, the language of what a body can do when pushed past every ordinary limit. Fire, lightning, ice. The bracelet could channel all of these through his strikes, turning every blow into something elemental and extraordinary. something called axiom force that made him faster, more fluid, more able to move through danger the way water moves through fingers. Impossible to fully catch, impossible to stop. And there was the crow's wing, a gliding mechanism that let him carry himself through the air for distances that would have seemed like pure fantasy back in Pywel. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being a soldier, a good, practical, battle-trained soldier who has spent his whole life trusting in the weight of a sword and the strength of his arms and the loyalty of the people beside him. And suddenly finding yourself capable of flying. Now you might wonder, was this a gift? Was the abyss being kind to Kliff? And the answer, as with most things in Pywel, is wonderfully complicated. Because the abyss had done something extraordinary for a civilization long before Kliff's time, too. It had given them its power freely, it seemed. It had let them build those impossible islands and those humming machines and all those wonders that were now scattered across 5 regions as mysterious ruins. It had made them mighty, and then it had consumed them. This is the secret buried in the heart of the abyss's gift to Kliff. Somewhere in the ancient past, a people had reached up and taken hold of this same power, had built a civilization on top of it, and the abyss had eventually turned on them. Or perhaps they had turned on themselves, drawn too greedily on a source that had limits they refused to respect. The stories were old and fragmentary, the way the most important stories always seem to be. But the ruins were real, the artifacts that fell from the abyss to the lands below, strange, power-giving items that multiple factions across Pywel competed to collect, were real. The axiom bracelet on Kliff's wrist was real. Whether it was a blessing or a trap was a question that could not be answered that night. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the difference didn't matter. Kliff found his way, eventually, to a body of water within the abyss, and a hand reached down and pulled him out. He woke up in a river in a region called Hernand. A local man named Sebastian stood over him, dripping, looking at this half-dead stranger he had just fished out of the current, with an expression that probably mixed concern with considerable bewilderment. Kliff lay on the bank and breathed. The sun was somewhere in the sky. The air smelled of earth and grass and the ordinary world. He was alive, and somewhere back in Pywel, his scattered companions were trying to survive without him. That would not do at all. Chapter 3, The Duchy of Hernand, where a wounded wolf learns to walk again. You know what it's like when you've been very sick or very hurt, and you have to start again from the beginning. When even the smallest things feel like achievements, because your body has forgotten for a little while how to do them. That's where Kliff was, in Hernand. Starting again. Hernand was not Pywel. It did not know Kliff. It did not know the Greymanes. It had its own troubles, its own politics, its own web of merchants and nobles, and ordinary people trying to get through the day in a world that was rapidly becoming less stable and more frightening. The king of Demenis, the most powerful king on the continent, the monarch whose authority had been the closest thing Pywel had to a unifying force, had fallen into a coma. Not dead, just absent, suspended somewhere between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond, and taking with him every political certainty that the continent had built around his continued existence. Into this uncertainty, over 100 factions were expanding like water rushing into a cracked vessel. Every noble house, every warband, every religious order, every merchant guild with enough swords to back its ambitions, all of them were repositioning, recalculating, sensing the vacuum at the center of the continent, and wondering if they could be the force that filled it. The Black Bears were certainly wondering this. Muad'Dib, who had already shattered the Greymanes, and presumably assumed that was the last obstacle between him and his ambitions, was moving through Pywel with growing confidence. He did not know about the man who had been fished out of a river in Hernand. That was going to be his undoing. But not yet, not for a long time yet. Kliff, to his enormous credit, did not immediately announce himself. He did not march into the nearest tavern and declare that the acting captain of the Greymanes had returned from the dead. And would anyone who had a grudge against the Black Bears please line up in an orderly fashion? He was smarter than that, and more honest with himself. He knew what he was in that moment, a wounded man in a strange place with no resources, no companions, and no authority that anyone in Hernand would recognize. So he started small. He helped people. He fixed things. He solved problems, not the grand, continent-shaking problems of war and power, but the ordinary human problems of a duchy going about its life. A merchant guild that had been taken over by a violent criminal named Kyloch the Hornsplitter. A population that needed someone willing to do difficult things in order to make their days a little safer. Kliff did those things, quietly, methodically, with the same focused care he'd always given to looking after the people in his charge. And in doing so, something remarkable happened. Not magic, not destiny, something simpler and more durable than either. He earned trust. A man named Shakatu, who ran the Gold Leaf Merchant Guild, and who had more connections across Pywel than almost anyone, recognized in Kliff the quality that separated reliable people from simply useful ones. He recognized integrity. He saw a man who did what he said he would do and didn't ask for more than was fair. And Shakatu, who had survived in a world of 100 factions by being very good at recognizing quality when he saw it, decided that Kliff was worth helping. Marquis Serkis agreed. And with the Marquis's support, and Shakatu's connections, and the goodwill of a duchy that now had reasons to wish him well, Kliff received something he had not had since the night at the Hill of No Return. He received a place, a specific place, on a hill called Howling Hill, with land to build on and the permission to build. It wasn't Peylun. It wasn't the home that Jian had made for them in the old days, but it was ground under their feet, and in Pywel, ground under your feet was no small thing. This is where the Greymanes began again. Think of how a fire is relit after it's gone out. Not with a great blazing torch, but with a single spark carefully tended. That's how Howling Hill became the new Greymane camp, one member found, then another. Unka, massive, loyal, devastating with his great axe, one of Kliff's oldest companions, was reunited with Kliff after a clash with Muad'Din's forces at a fortified location called Ashclaw Keep. And that reunion was the moment the story shifted. It was the moment Kliff stopped being a lone survivor and started being a leader again. Others followed. Jian, the strategist whose sharp mind had kept the Greymans alive through more crises than anyone could count. Naira, versatile and fierce, whose loss had been among the most painful Kliff had carried since the night at the hill. Damien, not a Greymane by birth or origin, but something that would become equally important. A noblewoman of the fallen House Spencer, taken in by a swordmaster after losing everything, who arrived in Kliff's orbit through a tangle of circumstance and stayed because she recognized in the Greymans the same thing they had always been to each other. A choice. A community you built rather than one you were born into. Bit by bit, the camp grew. Not just in numbers, in weight. In the gravity that comes from people committing to each other in a world that keeps trying to pull them apart. And bit by bit, the troubles that came to Howling Hill grew as well. Because word traveled in Pywel, and word that a leader named Kliff was gathering the Greymans again would not stay secret forever. And there were others besides the Black Bears, with reasons to watch that development very, very carefully. There is a feature in the game that allows Kliff, once the camp at Howling Hill is sufficiently established, to unlock a barber shop. A small, absurd, wonderful touch that speaks to the entire philosophy of what the Greymanes are rebuilding. After everything, after the night at the Hill of No Return and the Abyss, and the long road through Hernand, the camp grows enough that a man named Eric sets up his chair and his scissors and offers to cut hair, to change how people look, to let them choose, in the smallest possible way, what face they want to show the world. It sounds like a joke. It isn't. In a world that has been deciding things for the Greymans, taking their leader, scattering their members, nearly taking their captain, the ability to sit in a chair and say, "I want to look like this," is a profound act. It is the act of people who have reclaimed enough safety to have preferences again, enough stability to think about something other than survival. It is, in its modest and domestic way, the proof that Howling Hill has become a home and not merely a camp. Kliff, reportedly, has opinions about his hair. Of course he does. He's earned the right to. And woven through all of this domestic reconstruction, the building and the gathering, and the quiet acts of service in Hernand, and the slow earning of allies, was Kliff himself, changing in ways he may not have had words for. The man who had been thrown in a river was not quite the same as the man who had stood on the Hill of No Return. He had been somewhere else. He had been touched by something the rest of his companions had not. He carried the Axiom bracelet, and through it, a connection to the abyss that was ongoing, not finished, not sealed away safely in the past. Every time he used its powers, every surge of lightning through his fist, or crackle of fire along his blade was a reminder that he was still entangled with whatever had decided to keep him alive. Some of the game's reviewers noted that Kliff seems, after his ordeal, to move through events with a slightly uncanny calm, as if the experience in the abyss has dampened something in him or revealed something to him that he has not shared with anyone. Whether this is grief processed into stoicism or something the abyss actually did to the fabric of who he is, or simply the armor that soldiers wear when they cannot afford to fall apart, the game does not say. Perhaps deliberately, the ambiguity is part of the character's texture. What is clear is this: Kliff at Howling Hill is still Kliff, still loyal, still carrying the names, still the man who gets up because getting up is what you do. But there is a new dimension to him, visible in the way he uses his powers, and the way he sometimes pauses at the edge of a cliff and looks up, not at the horizon ahead, but at the sky above, as if measuring something only he can see. He is, perhaps, listening. For what? He cannot say. But something in the abyss learned the sound of his heartbeat that night in the river, and he has not forgotten what it felt like to be heard by something vast and strange and impossible. But let's not rush ahead. Let's stay a little longer at the fire in that camp on Howling Hill, with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of people who thought they'd lost each other finding each other again. That's a good moment. That's one of the best kinds of moments. Let it linger. Chapter 4. Across the 5 lands, the long road to Muad'Din. Pywel is a big place, bigger than you can picture in a single thought. Let me describe it to you. In the east, there is Pewel, where this story began, where the Greymans were born, and where they were broken, and where someday, eventually, Kliff would have to return and face what had happened there. It is a land of competing warbands and old feuds, of grasslands that turn golden in autumn and mountains that cut the horizon into jagged teeth. It is Kliff's homeland, and it is complicated the way all homelands are complicated, beloved and painful in equal measure. Moving west, you find Hernand, the duchy where Kliff woke up, where he first rebuilt himself in the quiet and unglamorous way that real rebuilding happens. It has rivers that carry things away and bring things back, if you're lucky. It has a castle and a politics all its own, and a connection to the broader story that runs deeper than the surface suggests. To the north lies Dimenis, the kingdom of the sleeping king. If Pywel has a center, Dimenis is it, or was it, before the coma. It is the heart of the continent's political gravity, and it is rotten in ways that the king, if he could wake up, might not fully recognize. Conspirators move through its corridors. Factions that serve interests inimical to everything Kliff values have embedded themselves in its structures and are waiting patiently for the right moment to make their moves. Past Dimenis, further still, there is the region known as Delicia, a place defined by a peculiar and dangerous combination of wealth and technology and ambition. Where Dimenis is old power grown corrupt, Delicia is new power grown reckless. The people there have learned to use things they do not fully understand, to harness capabilities that carry consequences they are not accounting for. It is a mirror, in many ways, of what the ancient civilization did before the abyss consumed them. Kliff will eventually walk those streets and recognize the warning in the walls. And then there is the Crimson Desert itself, the desert that gives the game its name. Hot, vast, silent except for the wind, and riddled beneath its sands with things that the ancient civilization left behind. Ruins and artifacts and fissures that leak abyss energy into the world above, corrupting the creatures that live near them and turning the landscape into something that feels less like geography and more like a wound. Pywel is a beautiful and broken place. It is full of people trying their best and powerful forces making everything harder. It is, in short, the kind of world that needs a man like Kliff and keeps being unkind to him anyway. Through all of these places, Kliff traveled. He fought, oh, he fought. And the way he fought deserves a description all its own. He carried swords and spears and axes, shifting between them with the adaptability of a warrior who had learned that survival meant never being committed to only one way of doing things. He grabbed enemies and threw them, used their own weight against them, turned the ground and the heights and the physics of a brawl into weapons as readily as he turned the sword in his hand. He parried Muad'Din's soldiers with a fluidity that looked almost like dancing. If dancing were something people did in order to stay alive, and he learned along the way to observe, to watch an opponent move and find in the movement the technique they were using, to absorb it somehow through the act of combat itself. This was not a skill he had possessed before the abyss, or if he had possessed it, it had not been sharpened to this edge. The abyss had done something to the way Kliff processed what he saw. Every fight was now also a lesson. Every enemy was, in some strange and violent way, a teacher. This made him frightening to those who fought him more than once and noticed the change, and the axiom bracelet sang on his wrist. Fire when fire was needed. Lightning when something armored needed to be stunned. Ice when speed had to be stopped. Axiom force when the only way forward was to move faster than the enemy could follow. The crow's wing when a gap needed crossing that no human stride could manage. He was, in the most straightforward possible sense, becoming something beyond what he had been. And he was dimly, uncomfortably aware that this transformation carried a price that hadn't yet come due. Along the way, he learned things. He learned about the political games being played in Demenis, about spies embedded in allied factions, about conspirators who had positioned themselves near power and were quietly redirecting it toward purposes that served no one's well-being. He found evidence of imperial treachery, of encoded letters and hidden signet rings, and a web of manipulation that ran much deeper than a straightforward contest between warbands. He discovered that Muad'Din, whom he had always understood as a personal enemy, the man who killed his leader and threw him in a river, was not simply acting out of his own ambition. Muad'Din had found the abyss too. Muad'Din had access to dark abyss powers of his own, and Muad'Din had been offered something or promised something, by forces that were playing a longer and more terrible game than any single mercenary company's conquest of a continent. The mysteries of Pywel compounded as Kliff moved through them. Each region answered one question and opened three more. Each alliance forged and each enemy defeated revealed a new layer of the structure beneath the visible conflict. And gradually, slowly, the way dawn comes in on a winter morning, reluctantly, by degrees, Kliff began to understand that the enemy he had been pursuing in grief and rage was not actually the largest enemy. That Muad'Dib, for all his ferocity, was a vehicle for something much older and much more dangerous than a mercenary warlord's ambition. The abyss was bleeding into the world, not just through the fissures in the Crimson Desert, though those were real and growing, but through the people who had touched its power and been changed by it. Through the artifacts scattered across 5 regions that multiple factions hunted with a desperation that spoke less of strategic calculation and more of dependency. Through the very fabric of Pywel's political reality, which had been shaped over centuries by the proximity of this other realm and the power it offered to those willing to reach for it. The ancient civilization had reached for it, and the abyss had taken them. Now everyone was reaching for it again. And Kliff, who had been thrown into a river and been to the abyss and come back with a bracelet of unknown origin on his wrist, was in some ways the most entwined of all, whether he chose to be or not. The confrontation with Muad'Dib, when it came, was not only a confrontation between a mercenary captain and the man who had destroyed his family. It was a confrontation between 2 different relationships with power, 2 different answers to the question of what you do when the world offers you something that can make you unstoppable. Muad'Dib had taken everything offered and asked for more, and something in him had curdled into something that could no longer be called simply ambition. It had become something that served the very force it believed it was using. Kliff chose differently, or rather, because Kliff was never someone who made grand philosophical declarations. He simply continued being what he had always been. He fought for the names in his chest, not for the power in his wrist. He used the abyss's gifts to protect and not to dominate. And that difference, small and unspoken as it was, turned out to matter in ways that neither of them fully understood until the end. Chapter 7, when Kliff finally faced Muad'Dib in the decisive battle, ended not in triumph, but in collapse. A cutscene showed Kliff incapacitated, his body having given everything it had recovering from the fight's aftermath. And the player, in a beautiful piece of narrative design, was handed control of Unka, the great loyal friend, the bruiser with the axe and the arm-mounted cannon, who had to carry the fight while his captain healed. Sometimes the story passes to someone else for a while. Sometimes the people who love you have to be the strong ones. That's not defeat. That's just the shape of how things actually work. Chapter 5, The Abyss Incarnate. What Kliff found at the end of everything. We're getting near the end now. Not the end of Kliff's story. That continues. out beyond the horizon, in a world that still needs people who will fight for the right reasons. But the end of this particular telling. Settle in for the last chapter. It's the longest and the deepest, and it has something true in it that I want you to carry with you into sleep. The final chapters of Kliff's journey across Pywel brought him to a truth that the entire story had been building toward. The threat was never really Muad'Dib. Muad'Dib was the instrument, the hand, the sword in someone else's grip. The true threat was the thing that had been growing in the abyss since the ancient civilization had reached too far and pulled something awake that should have been left sleeping. The abyss incarnate awaited him in the imperial palace of Dimenis, a multi-stage confrontation that the game presents as the culmination of everything Kliff had learned and endured and become. Think of the most spectacular fight you have ever seen described. Now make it bigger. Now make it personal in ways that a battle between armies cannot be personal, fought not for strategy or territory, but for the question of what the world was going to be going forward. Whether Pywel would be consumed the way the ancient civilization was consumed, or whether someone who had been to the abyss and come back would choose differently than the ones who had come before. The first stage was a battle alongside companions. All the people Kliff had gathered, all the names he had been carrying in his chest for the entire journey, fighting together against the physical form of something that should not be possible. Unka, enormous and unstoppable. Damien, fast as lightning with her rapier dancing and her gun singing. Jian and Naira, and all the ones who had found their way back to each other. The Greymanes, not as they had been, because you cannot unbreak what has been broken and remake it as exactly the same thing, but as what they had become. Stronger in some ways, more aware of what they were to each other. A family that had chosen each other a second time, which is perhaps the most sacred kind of choosing. Then the second stage. And here is where it gets quiet and important, and the kind of deep that makes good bedtime stories stick with you. Kliff entered the abyss dimension alone, not because his companions couldn't follow, they would have. Every single one of them would have followed him into that impossible space without hesitation. But this part of the fight could only be fought by the person who had been to the abyss and returned, who had accepted its gifts and carried its bracelet and walked through its alien geometry and come out the other side without becoming what Muad'Dib had become. It could only be fought by the one who knew the abyss from the inside, but hadn't been consumed by it. One on one. In that other place, where the rules of the ordinary world didn't apply, and the key, the strange and beautiful and perfectly fitting key to the final confrontation, was not power. It was not the axiom bracelet charged to its fullest. It was something called the Crimson Counter, a particular kind of parrying, a skill that required Kliff to watch very carefully for a specific moment, a flash of red in the attack, and respond not with force, but with redirection, with the understanding that the way to defeat something overwhelming was not to outpower it, but to turn its own energy back on itself. 3 times Kliff executed the crimson counter. 3 times he watched and waited and responded with precision instead of brute force. 3 times he answered the abyss's most extreme offering unlimited power, unchecked, devouring with the one thing that had always defined him. Not ambition, not destiny, not the desire for more, loyalty, restraint, the choosing of something small and human and real over something vast and terrible and consuming. And it was enough. It was always going to be enough. That's the thing about the kind of strength that comes from knowing exactly what you're fighting for. It doesn't have to be the biggest strength in the room. It just has to be real. In the standard ending of the story, Kliff leaves the capital as the dust settles. The Greymanes, their purpose temporarily complete, go their separate ways, each companion moving out into a world that is beginning, slowly and painfully, to heal. Unka back to the fights that sustain him. Damien toward whatever the fallen House Spencer still owes the world. Jian and Naira and the others toward their own versions of the next thing. And Kliff rides alone into a sunrise, determined, a little tired, carrying the same names he has always carried in the same chest that has survived more than it was made to survive. The Axiom bracelet is still on his wrist. The abyss is still out there. The final epilogue quest makes clear that a fissure in the Crimson Desert is still leaking, that the abyss threat is not fully resolved, that somewhere in the impossible floating islands above the world, something is still paying attention. But Pywel is healing, and a soldier who knows what he's fighting for is riding toward the horizon. And somewhere back at Howling Hill, there is a fire, and there are people who will keep it burning until he comes back. That's not a bad way for a story to end. For those who completed enough of Pywel's hidden quests and side stories, who walked every road and helped every person and read every lore page tucked into the knowledge menu like secrets kept in drawers. There was a second ending, the true ending. And in that one, the companions don't go their separate ways at all. They stay. They build. The Greymanes become not just a warband, but something closer to what Jian had always dreamed they could be. A genuine community, rooted and growing. A place that people come to rather than one that people leave. In the true ending, Kliff stays with them. That's the one I like best. That's the one worth working toward. Epilogue, what the abyss left behind. One last thing before you close your eyes. The world of Pywel is not finished. A fissure bleeds abyss energy into the desert. The sleeping king has not woken. Somewhere in the floating islands above the world, the ruins of that ancient civilization still hum with whatever power consumed them. And the Axiom bracelet is still on Kliff's wrist, still of unknown origin, still channeling something that no living scholar can fully explain. Here is what the epilogue quests show, in their quiet way. The work of healing a continent is not the kind of work that ends in a single battle. Kliff goes back to a harvest festival in the villages that sustained the Greymanes during the war. Ordinary people, farmers and craftspeople and cooks, who kept things running while the warriors were away doing the things that warriors do. He eats their food and talks to their children, and is, for a few hours, simply a man at a festival rather than the person who has to carry everything. He visits Delicia, where the conspirators have been removed, and the city's remarkable technology is being redirected carefully, slowly toward purposes that help people rather than harm them. He goes back to the Crimson Desert and finds the fissure and seals it one more time. And then he comes home to Howling Hill for a last gathering, and the companions share their plans, and the world continues to turn. It is small-scaled and domestic and deeply human, this epilogue. After the abyss incarnate, after 12 chapters of expanding catastrophe and revelation and hard-won triumph, the story ends with a man going home, with a fire burning, with people who are glad to see him. It is, perhaps, the best kind of ending, not the one that shouts, the one that breathes. Kliff Macduff, because that is his full name, the name his voice actor Alec Newman wrestled with for 5 years, as Pearl Abyss kept reshaping who this man was, recording iteration after iteration in studios, while the story evolved around him, pushing and pushing for clarity about what this character was and who he needed to be, is not done. His story was always bigger than one campaign, one region, one set of 12 chapters. The lore of Pywel contains mysteries that 100 hours of exploration do not resolve. There are names mentioned in passing that haven't been explained. There are ruins in the Crimson Desert that nobody has mapped. There are forces in the abyss that were watching when Kliff passed through and have been watching ever since. He doesn't know all of this. He probably suspects some of it. He is, after all, a man who has learned to pay very careful attention to things that don't add up. What he knows is simpler. What he knows is the thing that has always been true, the bedrock beneath every supernatural experience and political complication, and near death and impossible revival. He knows the names of his companions. He knows what he would do to keep them safe. He knows that the Greymane stand for something, even when standing for something is expensive, even when the world would prefer that everyone just look out for themselves and let the big forces do whatever the big forces want to do. And in a world of 100 factions, all pushing against each other, in a world where a king sleeps and an abyss bleeds and ancient civilizations leave warnings in the form of ruins that nobody reads carefully enough, that knowledge is not nothing. That knowledge, in fact, is everything. The fire is low now. The story is done, or at least this part of it. Out in the wide world of Pywel, Kliff is riding toward his next sunrise, and the Greymanes are waiting for him, and the abyss is watching. And somewhere beneath the Crimson Desert, something ancient is still humming. But that's for another night. Sleep well, told in the tradition of the traveling storytellers of Hernand. For all those who asked what happened to the gray wolf, who was thrown in a river and came back. For Jian, who made something worth protecting. For Unka, who carried his captain when his captain couldn't walk. For all the names that are worth carrying.